My mother-in-law raised her glass before half the town, declaring both family estates would go to Vanessa. She thought she was handing over a crown, but she was actually signing her own confession. She had no idea that I analyzed title records for a living, that my husband's grandmother was perfectly sharp, and that the real paperwork had already been filed before the party started. Soon, she would learn how someone can occupy a home for years and legally remain nothing but a squatter. My name is Eloise Gray. I am 37 years old, a proud Irish-Scottish American, and a senior title record analyst at Cedar Ledger Title and Escrow. Most people find property law dry, but I see it as the invisible framework holding the world together. Tonight, however, the only thing I felt holding together was my own fraying patience. A dull, rhythmic pounding had taken root at the base of my skull, a physical manifestation of the dread I always felt when summoned to the Mercer family estate. We were seated around the massive mahogany dining table in the main Georgian house, the air thick with the scent of roasted lamb and manufactured tension. Beside me sat my husband, Nolan, at 43. He was a union electrician who spent his days wrestling with conduit and high-voltage panels. He looked completely drained. He had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift, his hands still stained with grease and smelling faintly of copper wire. Yet he was forced to be here. His mother had insisted on a mandatory dinner for a major family decision, a phrase that always heralded some new flavor of misery. At the head of the table, my mother-in-law, Diane Mercer, held court. She was dressed in a sweeping emerald silk gown, looking as though she were about to host a charity gala rather than a Wednesday night dinner with her immediate family. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid with self-importance. Across from me was my sister-in-law, Vanessa. She spent the first half of the meal aggressively scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails tapping against the screen. She wore an expression of practiced boredom, though a predatory gleam sparked in her eyes whenever the conversation drifted toward the concept of the family's future. Then, Diane cleared her throat. She did not tap her glass, but she shifted her posture in a way that demanded absolute silence. I have gathered you all here tonight because it is time to formalize the future of the Mercer legacy, Diane announced, her voice dripping with artificial grandeur. She looked past Nolan and me entirely, her gaze settling warmly on her daughter. After much consideration, I have decided that both the main Georgian estate and the riverside cottage will be left to Vanessa. She possesses the precise image and modern aesthetic required to carry our family's heritage into the next generation. The dining room went dead silent. The pounding in my head flared into a sharp ache. Both houses, not just the main estate, but the cottage Nolan and I had spent the last 7 years physically holding together. Diane finally turned her condescending gaze toward us. She offered a tight, patronizing smile. Now, do not feel slighted, Nolan. You and Eloise are such good behind-the-scenes workers. You are practically the maintenance backbone of this property, but managing an estate of this caliber requires a certain social vision, a cultural cachet. Frankly, ownership requires a public face that neither of you is equipped to provide. Nolan stared at his plate, his jaw muscles feathering. He was too tired, too beaten down by a lifetime of her casual cruelty, to argue, but I was not. And what about Celeste? I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy air. I looked down the table toward Nolan's grandmother. Celeste Mercer was 85 years old. She suffered from severe mobility issues and spoke with a slow, deliberate drawl that Diane frequently mistook for cognitive decline. Does the actual owner of this property have a say in who inherits her home? Diane waved a manicured hand, brushing my question away like a pesky fly. Oh, please, Mother is far beyond making these complicated financial choices. I hold her power of attorney. Everything is completely in hand. I make the decisions now. Vanessa finally set her phone face down on the table, a smug, victorious smirk spreading across her lips. It is going to be incredible, she gushed, leaning forward. I already have the vision board completed. I am going to gut the cottage and turn it into a luxury content retreat for high-tier influencers. We can host brand activations, wellness weekends, maybe even an exclusive podcast studio. The heritage aesthetic will sell for a fortune online. My stomach plummeted. This was not about family sentiment or preserving a historical home. This was a calculated commercialization plan. Vanessa wanted to turn a quiet, beautiful riverside sanctuary into a loud, transient cash grab. I glanced back at Celeste. To the casual observer, the elderly woman seemed completely detached. Her eyes half closed as she stared at her untouched soup. Diane certainly thought her mother was oblivious, but then, in a moment so subtle everyone else missed it. Celeste moved. Tap, tap, tap. 3 deliberate, rhythmic strikes of her wooden cane against the hardwood floor beneath the table. I watched as Celeste lifted her chin. Her eyes, usually clouded with fatigue, suddenly locked onto Diane with a sharp, piercing clarity. It was a look of cold calculation, a signal. It was entirely intentional, and it told me everything I needed to know. Celeste was not a passenger in this car. She was wide awake. Diane, completely blind to the warning signs, kept talking. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her own authority. Once the paperwork is finalized next week, the transition will be seamless. The deed transfer is simple. I am initiating a quitclaim based on my grantor rights, bypassing the probate restrictions entirely to ensure fee simple absolute for Vanessa. A chill ran down my spine, replacing my anger with a profound sense of dread. Diane was trying to sound like a brilliant estate manager, but she was throwing around legal terms completely out of context. You cannot just use a standard power of attorney to unilaterally gift real estate to your own daughter to bypass probate, nor can you arbitrarily establish fee simple absolute if the chain of title is encumbered, to a union electrician or a lifestyle influencer. Her words sounded authoritative and final, but to a title record analyst who spent 40 hours a week untangling the legal mess of property ownership, it sounded like a confession. Diane was lying. And worse, she was making a move that made no legal sense unless the paperwork she was relying on was either fatally flawed or entirely fabricated. As I looked at the smug faces of my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, my unease solidified into a cold, hard resolution. They thought they had already won the game. They did not realize they had just invited the referee to the table. For 7 relentless years, Nolan and I had functioned as the unpaid, unappreciated life support system for the Mercer properties. We had moved into the cramped annex connected to the garage under the guise of helping out temporarily, only to realize the entire estate was rotting from the inside out. I remembered the freezing winter of our second year when the ancient boiler finally died. Nolan spent 72 straight hours down in the damp, freezing cellar, rebuilding the system part by part so his grandmother would not freeze. We paid for the parts from our joint savings account. I remembered the sweltering July we spent coordinating the massive termite tenting, the months of foundation damp-proofing, and the terrifying week Nolan spent harnessed to the chimney, replacing missing slate tiles on the heavy roof. Most agonizing of all was the quiet afternoon I marched into the county tax assessor office and handed over a cashier check for $24,000 to cover the delinquent property taxes Diane had carelessly ignored. We wiped out our emergency fund to save the houses from being auctioned off, while Diane continued to play the grand lady of the manor. Diane loved to posture for the local historical society, proudly referring to herself as the steadfast preserver of the family legacy. The reality was, she only drifted through the grand halls when she was hosting a charity cocktail hour or an afternoon tea. The grueling, daily grind of maintaining a 19th century estate, not to mention managing Celeste and her complex daily care and medication schedule, fell squarely on our shoulders. Meanwhile, Vanessa had spent the last decade burning through the bank accounts of her mother with an endless parade of failed, trendy reinventions. First came the online luxury boutique that folded after 6 months. Then came the lifestyle podcast, which required $30,000 in high-end audio equipment, but produced exactly 4 episodes. After that was her manifestation coaching phase, followed closely by a bespoke event studio that never booked a single client, every single time. Diane bailed her out, proudly pouring more seed money into the next empty venture of Vanessa under the guise of supporting female entrepreneurship. The sheer audacity of their entitlement materialized in our driveway the very next morning. I was standing in the kitchen, staring into my black coffee, when Vanessa swept through the front doors wielding a digital laser measure like a magic wand. She did not even say good morning. She just aimed the red dot at the thick plaster wall separating the grand foyer from the formal dining room. "I am going to completely open this space up," Vanessa declared, tapping a manicured finger against her chin. "It is way too suffocating. We need to let the light in. Update the aesthetic to something more organic and minimalist. The influencers will expect a seamless indoor-outdoor flow." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I knew the architectural blueprints of this house better than I knew my own face. Over half the walls she was casually targeting with her red laser were primary load-bearing structures holding up the second floor. If she hired some cheap contractor to take a sledgehammer to them for the sake of an open concept, the entire master suite would cave in. Before I could explain the basic principles of structural engineering to her, Vanessa pivoted sharply toward me. "By the way, Eloise, I need you and Nolan to pack up and clear out of the annex in 3 weeks. I have already promised the space to a local wardrobe stylist I'm collaborating with for the launch. You understand, right? It is just business. I need the rental income to offset the renovation costs." She spoke as if the property deed was already framed on her bedroom wall, her tone dripping with the casual cruelty of someone who had never worked for a single thing in her life. 2 hours later, an email from Diane landed in my inbox, followed immediately by a hard copy slipped aggressively under the annex door. It was a poorly drafted packet of legal documents. The first page was a construction liability waiver, a grotesque document designed to absolve Diane of any responsibility for the structural repairs Nolan had painstakingly completed, classifying them as unpermitted alterations. The second page was an ironclad agreement for us to vacate the annex within 21 days. A yellow sticky note slapped on the front read, "Please sign and return before the transfer ceremony. Let us keep this clean and amicable." They were trying to erase our equity, our labor, and our existence from the property in one fell swoop. The final piece of the puzzle arrived just before noon via a bonded courier. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the gold-embossed logo of the Ashcroft Bell Probate Group. Inside was a heavy cardstock invitation to something called the Mercer Legacy Brunch, scheduled to take place in exactly 3 days. The itinerary boasted a catered garden reception culminating in a live property transfer signing ceremony in front of a curated list of local dignitaries, politicians, and socialites. Diane was turning the theft of our home into a public coronation. I pulled out the secondary sheet tucked behind the invitation, which outlined the property descriptions meant for the public record. My eyes scanned the dense, dry legal jargon until they hit the block of text describing the riverside cottage. My breath hitched. I read the line again, my heart hammering against my ribs. There it was, a glaring, amateur mistake hiding in plain sight. The parcel identification number listed for the cottage was formatted with a -7 suffix. The county assessor office had completely overhauled their zoning grids and permanently retired that specific alphanumeric format exactly 4 years ago. It was a microscopic detail, invisible to a union electrician, an aspiring influencer, or a delusional socialite, but to a senior title analyst who spent 40 hours a week staring at property deeds. It was a blaring siren in the dark. Diane was not using freshly drafted, legally vetted instruments. She was recycling old, obsolete paperwork from a time before the county updated its systems. She was using a defective document, hoping no one would notice the discrepancy amidst the champagne and the string quartet at a fancy brunch. My hands stopped shaking. The blinding anger that had been choking me all morning crystallized into a sharp, icy calm. I folded the heavy paper with deliberate precision and slid it back into the cream envelope. I would not storm into the main house and scream. I would not give them the satisfaction of witnessing an emotional breakdown, nor would I warn them of their fatal error. Instead, I grabbed my car keys and headed straight for my office. I was going to do exactly what I was trained to do. I was going to pull the entire chain of title, rip open the county records, and dissect every single public filing attached to the Mercer name until I found the rot hiding underneath her pristine legal facade. The office was entirely empty by 7 o'clock that evening. I sat alone in the glow of my dual monitors, the silence of the commercial building pressing in on me. I bypassed the standard title search software and logged directly into the raw, unfiltered county clerk database. I typed in the names and the real parcel numbers, completely ignoring the outdated identifiers printed on that ridiculous brunch invitation. The query took exactly 4 seconds to return a result. When the screen populated, my breath hitched in my throat. Celeste did not own the estate, not legally, not for a very long time. The recorded deed clearly showed that both the primary residence and the cottage were conveyed into the Mercer Homestead Preservation Trust nearly 15 years ago. My eyes scanned the digitized pages of the public filing. Diane had brazenly claimed she held a power of attorney that gave her absolute control, but basic fiduciary law dictates that a standard power of attorney does not automatically grant the agent the authority to transfer, sell, or manipulate assets held within an irrevocable or strictly managed trust. Her supposed trump card was legally hollow. I dug deeper, opening a new tab for the county tax collector portal. If the property was safely tucked in a trust, who was actually paying the bills? I pulled the payment history for the last 3 fiscal quarters. Smeared across the screen in glaring red text were multiple delinquency notices, local municipal taxes, and the premium for the massive catastrophic property insurance policy were severely past due. I frowned, tracing the data lines. Why had no warning letters ever arrived at the main house? I scrolled down to the contact information section. The official mailing address for all municipal correspondence had been quietly changed 18 months prior, rerouted to a private post office box located 2 towns over, a box registered solely to Diane. She was actively hiding the financial hemorrhage from everyone. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me. It was a notification from a local community page, but as I swiped to clear it, I inadvertently opened a social media app. The algorithm, practically reading my proximity to the family drama, fed me a sponsored teaser reel from Vanessa. The video featured panning shots of the cottage garden and a slow sweep of the living room. Bold, modern text flashed across the screen announcing the Riverside Creator House coming soon. My stomach turned as I read the caption. She was not just planning, she was executing. Vanessa was already boasting about securing non-refundable booking deposits from 2 different lifestyle influencers for the upcoming fall season. She was commercializing property she did not own. I threw my phone down and turned back to the county database, a new, desperate energy fueling my search. I needed the rules of the trust. Usually, full trust documents are entirely private, but to establish authority with third parties, a memorandum of trust must be recorded publicly. I found it buried beneath a pile of old surveyor reports. I read the dense, legal text once, then I read it again, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a monumental twist. The document explicitly outlined the living arrangements for the family. Diane did not have a vested ownership interest or any guaranteed future claim to the title. What she had was a conditional right of occupancy. She was allowed to reside on the premises, but that right was chained to ironclad stipulations. The occupant was legally bound to submit an annual maintenance and financial report to an independent trustee. Furthermore, the memorandum contained a strict, unequivocal prohibition. The property could not be used as collateral, nor could it be subjected to commercial promotion or business operations without the express written consent of that independent trustee. Diane was not the lord of the manor. She was merely a tenant with a very strict lease, and she was currently violating every single clause. I printed everything. The stack of paper felt as heavy as a cinder block in my hands. When I finally returned to the annex, the digital clock on the microwave read 9:45. Nolan was pacing the narrow kitchen, his heavy work boots leaving faint scuff marks on the linoleum. When I laid the documents on the small dining table and explained exactly what his mother was doing, the color drained from his face, quickly replaced by a furious, mottled red. He grabbed his heavy denim jacket off the back of the chair. He swore loudly, declaring he was going to march across the driveway, kick down the front door of the main house, and shove the papers right in her face. I physically threw myself between him and the door, pressing my hands flat against his chest. I felt his heart racing like a trapped animal. I told him no. I explained that confronting her tonight would be a catastrophic mistake. If we tipped our hand now, Diane would panic. She would immediately call her cut-rate lawyers, change her narrative, hide the stolen money, and find a way to muddy the waters before the brunch. We needed her to feel invincible. We needed her to walk right into her own trap, publicly and irrevocably. Reluctantly, Nolan dropped his jacket, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a tense, vibrating exhaustion. An hour later, I crossed the dark courtyard to the main house to help Celeste with her evening routine. The house was dead quiet, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the antique rugs. I found her sitting up in her heavy mahogany bed, the bedside lamp casting a warm, frail glow over her face. I handed her the small paper cup containing her nighttime medications and a glass of water. As she swallowed the pills, I sat on the edge of the mattress. I kept my voice low, barely a whisper. I told her I knew about the trust. I asked her who the independent trustee was, who was supposed to be holding Diane accountable all these years. Celeste did not look at me. She did not say a word. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her frail, trembling hand. She pointed a single crooked finger toward the open bedroom door, directing my gaze down the dark hallway toward the formal living room. Specifically, she pointed toward the massive, antique Steinway piano that had sat untouched in the corner for over a decade. She lowered her hand, her eyes fluttering shut as the medication began to take hold. Her lips barely moved, but in the silent room, the two words she breathed out sounded like a gunshot. Blue Ledger. I stood up, the hairs on my arms standing at attention. I had just been handed the key. It was not a brass key to a deadbolt, but the key to unlocking the entire fraud, exposing every lie, and burning the false kingdom of Diane to the ground. The hallway was submerged in shadows as I made my way back to the formal living room. My heart hammered a steady, anxious rhythm against my ribs. The grand Steinway piano sat in the corner, a massive, silent beast draped in the moonlight filtering through the French doors. I approached it slowly, the floorboards groaning in quiet protest beneath my feet. I gripped the edges of the heavy leather and mahogany bench and pulled upward. The hinge gave a soft, metallic sigh. Inside, buried beneath a chaotic layer of yellowed sheet music and forgotten hymnals, was a thick, fabric-bound book, the Blue Ledger. I lifted it out. It was heavy, smelling faintly of dry paper and old dust. I carried it over to a small reading lamp, clicked the switch, and began to turn the pages. It was not just a record. It was a meticulously organized archive of betrayal. Glued to the heavy pages were original invoices for structural materials, carbon copies of certified mail receipts, and formal letters from a legal firm demanding the annual fiduciary disclosures that Diane had simply ignored and hidden in this bench. Woven between the official documents were small squares of paper bearing the spidery, precise handwriting of my husband's grandmother. They chronicled a devastating timeline of deliberate neglect. One note from 4 years ago detailed how a designated repair fund of $15,000 was abruptly drained by Diane to host a lavish summer garden gala. Exactly 2 months later, the unpatched gutters caused severe water damage to the plaster ceilings in the east wing. Another entry noted that money meant for termite abatement had been diverted to cover the legal fees of yet another failed business venture of Vanessa. Celeste knew everything. I looked back toward the dark hallway, my perception of the Mercer matriarch shifting entirely. Diane had spent the last 5 years convincing the entire town that her mother was a fragile, failing woman whose mind was slowly dissolving into the fog of dementia. It was a convenient narrative that allowed Diane to operate without scrutiny, but the truth was far colder and infinitely more heartbreaking. Celeste was not incapacitated. She was merely physically exhausted. She spoke with a delayed cadence because her body was failing, not her mind. She had weaponized her own physical decline, choosing absolute silence to observe the depths of her daughter's greed. She no longer trusted her own child, so she became a spy in her own home. The following morning, after Diane left the estate for a supposedly vital spa appointment, I sat beside the bed of Celeste with a yellow legal pad, through short, raspy sentences and quick, shaky scribbles on the paper. She gave me the final piece of the structural puzzle. The trust possessed a fail-safe mechanism, a designated successor trustee. Her name was Maeve Corrigan. Maeve was a formidable, notoriously aggressive estate litigator and had been a fiercely loyal friend to the late son of Celeste, the father of Nolan. I took my lunch break in my car that afternoon, locking the doors before dialing the number Celeste had provided. Maeve answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp, professional, and entirely unsurprised by my call. She confessed she had suspected for over 18 months that Diane was actively dodging her reporting duties and siphoning funds. However, suspicion was not actionable evidence in a probate court. Without tangible proof of a fiduciary breach, filing a motion would only trigger a costly, drawn-out discovery phase that Diane would fight tooth and nail. When I described the detailed contents of the blue ledger, the silence on the line was profound. The atmosphere shifted instantly from cautious inquiry to absolute warfare. Maeve simply stated she would take it from there. We moved with surgical precision. The very next afternoon, while Diane and Vanessa were away shopping for outfits for the upcoming event, Maeve coordinated a covert house call. An independent geriatric specialist arrived quietly at the back kitchen door. For 45 minutes, I stood guard by the front windows, every passing car engine making my pulse race, while the doctor conducted a comprehensive cognitive evaluation in the master bedroom. The entire session was recorded on a secure digital tablet. On camera, Celeste clearly and firmly articulated the current date, the exact nature of her financial assets, and her explicit, unyielding refusal to surrender control of the trust to Diane. The medical verdict was absolute and legally binding. Celeste Mercer was entirely of sound mind. Later that evening, Maeve called me back to outline our strategy. I expected her to file an immediate emergency injunction to halt whatever madness Diane was planning. Instead, Maeve proposed a tactical, agonizing delay. We needed to let Diane take the stage. We needed her to publicly, explicitly declare false ownership in front of dozens of witnesses. Maeve explained that letting Diane self-incriminate on a grand scale, committing fraudulent inducement in front of the local elite, would shatter any future defense she might mount, claiming she was acting under duress or a simple misunderstanding. We were not just stopping her, we were building a flawless legal trap. The plan was brilliant, but it came with a devastating personal cost. I had to keep Nolan completely in the dark until the final hour. When I returned to the room of Celeste to say goodnight, the guilt must have been written across every line of my face. I sat on the edge of her mattress and whispered that I hated lying to him. I hated watching my husband carry the heavy, daily weight of his mother's casual cruelty while I held the very weapon that could end it immediately. Celeste reached out. Her hand, papery and fragile, gripped my wrist with surprising, anchoring strength. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line on her notepad. Pushing it toward me, "Nolan is too good. You protect him." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. Nolan was a man of raw, immediate action and profound, instinctual loyalty. If he knew the extent of this betrayal right now, his righteous anger would explode. He would march out there and confront Diane immediately, destroying the delicate legal snare Maeve and I were weaving. He would give Diane the very warning she needed to scatter the evidence. Hire better lawyers, and spin a new web of lies. I hated the metallic taste of deception in my mouth. I hated the thought of looking my husband in the eyes and telling him everything was fine, while a hurricane gathered just off the coast of our lives. But as I gently closed the bedroom door and stepped into the dark hall, I accepted the burden. I would carry the secret. I would let the cold, sharp logic of the law override the burning need for immediate justice, because I finally understood it was the only guaranteed way to ensure Diane could never hurt him again. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly through the glass ceiling of the conservatory, turning the room into a sweltering greenhouse. Diane had arranged the wicker furniture to resemble a corporate mediation room. She sat perfectly composed in a floral armchair, a silver tray of iced tea sweating uselessly on the glass table between us. Vanessa was perched on a love seat next to a nervous-looking young woman holding an oversized clipboard. An event assistant hired for the upcoming spectacle, Nolan and I were directed to sit on the stiff wooden bench opposite them as soon as we sat down. Diane slid a thick manila folder across the glass. Inside were 3 fresh documents, a strict non-disclosure agreement, a blanket waiver absolving her of any reimbursement for our structural repairs, and a legally binding commitment for us to vacate the annex in exactly 30 days. "I know change is difficult," Diane began, her voice dripping with a sickening, rehearsed pity. She tilted her head, offering a condescending smile. "I want to personally thank you both for this temporary support phase. You have been perfectly adequate caretakers during this transitional period, but now that the family is moving in a more elevated direction, it is time for you to find a place better suited to your lifestyle." She was rewriting history right in front of us, reducing nearly a decade of our blood, sweat, and financial ruin into a casual favor she was now gracefully terminating. Beside me, Nolan let out a long, defeated exhale. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his mother's endless manipulation. He was entirely hollowed out. He reached toward the silver ballpoint pen resting on top of the folder. He was going to sign it. He was willing to sign away our home, our money, and our dignity just to end the suffocating psychological warfare. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his, stopping his fingers inches from the pen. I picked the silver instrument up and placed it gently on the far edge of the table. "We are not signing a single page of this," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "Nothing gets signed until our own legal counsel reviews every clause." The mask of the benevolent matriarch shattered instantly. Diane slammed her hand flat against the glass table, making the iced tea glasses rattle. The event assistant jumped in her seat. "You do not have legal counsel, you ungrateful little clerk," Diane spat, her voice rising to a shrill crescendo. "I hold absolute legal power over this estate. If you refuse to sign, I will have the county sheriff physically drag you and your husband off my property the exact second the transfer ceremony concludes. You will leave with absolutely nothing." It was time to fire the first warning shot. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. "Are you going to ask the sheriff to pay the delinquent tax letters you diverted to your private post office box? Or perhaps the sheriff can cover the lapsed property insurance premiums you have been hiding." I watched the color rapidly drain from her cheeks, but I did not stop. "And while we are discussing your absolute power, I would love to know how you plan to explain commercializing the Riverside property to the authorities when you have never received formal approval from the trust." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The event assistant stopped breathing. Vanessa dropped her phone onto her lap, her eyes wide with sudden, unmasked panic. Diane stumbled backward verbally, her arrogance replaced by a frantic, scrambling desperation. She completely lost her footing and blurted out the one secret she had desperately tried to keep buried. "You know absolutely nothing," Diane stammered, her hands trembling as she grabbed the edge of her chair. "The trust is a technicality. I already have an ironclad arrangement with a private commercial lender. The exact minute the transfer ceremony is complete, I am pulling equity out. I am remortgaging the main house to clear my personal ledgers, and no one is going to stop me." The room erupted. Vanessa shot up from the love seat, her face pale with terror. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Vanessa shrieked, her carefully curated influencer persona vanishing in an instant. "Remortgaging? You told me I owned the cottage free and clear. I already sold 3 premium retreat packages to my followers. I signed a binding media promotion contract yesterday based on your guarantee. If we do not have a clear title, those agencies will sue me for fraud." Diane tried to shout over her daughter, desperately trying to put the lid back on the Pandora's box she had just smashed open. But the damage was done. The unified front of the Mercer women had collapsed into a chaotic, self-destructive panic. I stood up, took Nolan by the arm, and quietly walked out of the sunroom, leaving them to tear each other apart. The fallout rippled into the night. Around 2 a.m, a faint, rhythmic thudding woke me. I slipped out of bed, leaving Nolan fast asleep behind, and crept through the dark courtyard into the main house. The formal living room looked like the scene of a burglary. Drawers were pulled from antique desks, file cabinets were thrown open, papers scattered across the Persian rugs. In the center of the room, illuminated only by the moonlight, Diane was frantically tearing through the piano bench, tossing old hymnals onto the floor, desperately hunting for the blue ledger. She knew I had seen something, and the paranoia was eating her alive. I stepped out of the shadows and walked quietly down the hallway. Stopping squarely in front of the bedroom door where Celeste slept, I did not say a word. I did not raise my hands. I simply stood there, an immovable physical barrier between the desperate woman and her elderly mother. Diane froze, clutching a fistful of sheet music. She looked like a cornered animal, her chest heaving, her hair wild and unkempt. She took one step toward me, but the absolute cold resolution in my eyes forced her to stop. We stood in a silent, suffocating standoff for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Diane broke eye contact. She dropped the papers onto the floor and let out a frantic, ragged breath. She began muttering to herself, a desperate rationalization meant to soothe her own terror. She whispered that I was bluffing. She convinced herself aloud that whatever documents I thought I had seen were meaningless, and that the original, binding paperwork had to be securely locked away at the Ashcroft Bell law firm, perfectly prepped for the brunch. I did not correct her. I let her cling to that false lifeline. I watched her turn and retreat into the darkness of the house, completely unaware that the trap was already set. The jaws were locked open, and she was only 2 days away from stepping right into it. Maeve Corrigan did not just practice estate law, she orchestrated it with cold precision. Within 48 hours of our initial phone call, she was standing at the county clerk counter, officially filing the instruments needed to dismantle the false kingdom my mother-in-law had built. Maeve submitted a comprehensive petition to activate her rights as the successor trustee. The grounds were indisputable, rooted firmly in the blue ledger, flagrant breach of fiduciary reporting duties, and a gross, documented abuse of the conditional residency rights. It was a silent, lethal legal missile launched directly at the foundation of the Mercer estate, and Diane was completely oblivious to its trajectory. We needed to bulletproof the transition to ensure no judge would ever entertain a claim of elder abuse or coercion. The following morning, we arranged for a mobile notary and 2 independent witnesses to slip quietly through the back entrance to the bedroom of Celeste. With a digital camera recording the entire session, Celeste formally signed a current, binding declaration of intent. Her voice was slow, but her gaze was sharp as she mandated that both the main house and the Riverside cottage remain permanently within the Preservation Trust. She explicitly banned any future fire sales or commercial liquidations. Most crucially, she legally anchored the right of residency and estate management solely to those who actually maintained the property, entirely cutting Diane out of the chain of stewardship. While Maeve locked down the legal framework, I dug back into the municipal zoning records and uncovered a spectacular technical twist, cross-referencing the plat maps. I discovered the Riverside cottage sat squarely inside a heavily monitored historical preservation easement. It was a protected heritage zone. If Vanessa actually took a sledgehammer to those load-bearing walls to create her coveted open concept, or if she attempted to run an unpermitted commercial event house with heavy foot traffic, the County Historical Commission would levy punitive fines amounting to tens of thousands of dollars per day. Vanessa was not inheriting a lucrative content retreat. She was actively sprinting toward a catastrophic financial meat grinder. I called Maeve that evening, asking if we should have a process server hand Diane a cease and desist notice before the Sunday event. Maeve let out a sharp, dry laugh over the phone and forbade it. Diane was already spending a small fortune to stage the brunch for the county elite. Maeve's point was simple. Do not interrupt a liar while she is building a public record against herself. We would let the event stand. The legal traps were perfectly set, but the heaviest burden was waiting for me in the cold annex garage. Nolan was under the hood of his truck, his hands covered in grease, the sharp scent of motor oil and sawdust hanging heavy in the air. I stood under the flickering fluorescent lights, my chest tight with anxiety, and finally told him the core truth. I laid it out plainly. His mother did not have the power of attorney she claimed. She had no legal right to transfer the houses, and her grand brunch was a complete fiction. Nolan dropped his heavy wrench. The solid steel hit the concrete floor with a deafening, violent crack. For a long, suffocating moment, he just stared at me. Then the realization settled over his features. He realized I had known this for days. He realized his grandmother knew. The argument that erupted was the most intense of our entire marriage. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, thick with raw betrayal and deep, festering hurt. He paced the narrow space between the workbench and the truck, demanding to know if I thought he was that weak. He asked if I honestly believed he was so fragile that he could not handle his own mother, that he needed to be managed and shielded like a child, while the women in his life plodded in the shadows. He felt completely emasculated, exactly as Celeste had feared. I did not back down, though my vision blurred with unshed tears. I stepped directly into his path, grabbing his grease-stained hands and forcing him to look at me. I told him I never doubted his strength. I doubted his capacity for cruelty. Diane had spent 4 decades weaponizing his inherent goodness, using tears, guilt, and maternal obligation to manipulate him into submission. If I had told him the truth on night 1, his righteous anger would have demanded an immediate, honest confrontation. He would have marched into the main house and demanded answers. And Diane would have cried, played the victim, and manipulated that confrontation to give herself the exact window of time she needed to destroy the trust documents and hide her financial crimes. I had to protect the endgame, even if it meant temporarily breaking his trust. Nolan pulled his hands away. He leaned against the side of his truck, staring at the concrete floor. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in on us. Then, he let out a long, ragged exhale. He pushed off the truck and walked over to the old metal filing cabinet in the corner of the garage. He yanked the bottom drawer open with such force it nearly derailed, and he started pulling out heavy, taped-up shoeboxes. He had overcome the shock. He was choosing to stand with me if we were going to war. My husband was bringing the heavy artillery. We spent the next 6 hours sitting on the freezing garage floor, building an undeniable, devastating battle file. We organized 7 years of hardware store receipts. We printed out high-resolution before and after photographs of the structural damage he had painstakingly repaired. We cataloged detailed logs of raw materials and thousands of hours of unpaid labor. Most damning of all, Nolan scrolled through his phone and printed dozens of saved text messages from Diane, messages dating back years, where she explicitly refused to hire licensed contractors, writing things like, "Just fix it first, and we will figure out the money later." By dawn, we had compiled a flawless armory of financial evidence, construction logs, a meticulously cited timeline of her trust violations, and our own sworn witness statements. We placed everything into 3 thick, heavy binders. We were no longer the exhausted background help waiting to be discarded. We were armed, united, and completely ready to face both the court of public opinion and the judge. Sunday morning arrived with the stifling, humid heat typical of late summer. The backyard of the main estate had been entirely transformed into a theatrical set for a fake coronation. Dozens of round tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the manicured lawn. A hired string quartet played a lively classical piece from the corner of the stone patio. Diane had invited the absolute elite of the county. There were prominent members of the local Historical Preservation Society, the president of the country club, and at least 3 local politicians sipping premium champagne. Diane floated through the crowd, dressed in a sweeping, tailored ivory pantsuit that screamed ultimate matriarch. She was playing the role of the benevolent queen passing the torch. Vanessa, meanwhile, looked as though she were attending her own wedding. She wore a stunning, backless white designer gown, continuously striking candid poses for a hired photographer and her own glowing smartphone screen. Acting every bit the new lady of the manor, then they brought out Celeste. The sight made my blood run cold. They had pushed her wheelchair onto the edge of the patio, wrapping her in a heavy tartan blanket despite the suffocating heat. They parked her there like a silent, tragic prop. She was meant to be the emotional backdrop for the grand performance of Diane, the fading ghost giving her silent blessing. I stood at the far edge of the gathering, near the manicured hedges, dressed in a simple, unassuming navy shift dress. I did not mingle. I did not drink the champagne. I simply watched the perimeter. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a single text message from Maeve. She and her legal assistant, along with a county process server, were parked just out of sight beyond the wrought iron front gates. They were ready. The string quartet abruptly ceased playing. Diane stepped up to a polished wooden podium that had been set up near the rose garden, tapping the microphone to command the attention of the 70 guests. A hushed silence fell over the lawn as the attendees turned toward her, crystal flutes catching the sunlight. "Dearest friends, esteemed colleagues, and beloved family," Diane began, her voice echoing perfectly through the outdoor speakers. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the fresh, vibrant future of the Mercer legacy. For generations, this land has been a beacon of our community, but preserving history requires more than just replacing slate tiles or rewiring old electrical boxes." She paused, letting her gaze sweep condescendingly over the crowd before landing briefly on where Nolan and I stood in the shadows. "There are those who are wonderful at fixing the physical cracks, the people who work tirelessly behind the scenes," Diane continued, her tone dripping with poisoned honey. "But true stewardship requires social vision. It requires an understanding of our elevated position in this town. That is why today, I am taking the necessary legal steps to ensure this estate transitions to someone who truly grasps that modern prestige." She gestured grandly to her daughter. The crowd offered a polite smattering of applause as Vanessa glided to the microphone. Vanessa beamed, grabbing the microphone with both hands. "Thank you, Mother, and thank you all for being here. I am so incredibly thrilled to announce the official launch of the Mercer Riverside Creative Residency. Starting this fall, both the main house and the Riverside property will be transformed into an exclusive high-tier content destination. We will be hosting corporate wellness retreats, brand activations, and ticketed influencer summits. I scanned the crowd. Several older members of the Historical Preservation Society shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vanessa was completely oblivious to the room. She was so intoxicated by her own perceived success that she was voluntarily confessing to the illegal commercialization of both properties into a live microphone. Dozens of guests had their phones raised, recording her every word for social media. It was the most beautifully executed, self-inflicted legal destruction I had ever witnessed. I did not make a single move to interrupt her. I let her speak for another 5 minutes, allowing her to dig the trench deeper and wider with every single syllable. When Vanessa finally finished her pitch to roaring applause from her own friends, she stepped back. Diane returned to the podium. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped forward, carrying a leather-bound folio. He was the private notary Diane had hired to legitimize the theater. "And now, to formalize this beautiful transition," Diane announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. The notary opened the folio on the podium. He handed Diane a heavy gold fountain pen. She leaned over the microphone, ensuring everyone could hear the scratch of the nib against the heavy paper. As the legally appointed attorney in fact for my mother, Celeste Mercer, I now sign this deed of transfer, Diane declared loudly. She signed the first page, then the second. She moved with absolute, terrifying confidence. She truly believed that signing a piece of paper in front of wealthy people made it an undeniable reality. She handed the pen back to the notary, who stamped the documents with a heavy, satisfying thud. The deed was done, or so she thought. Diane picked up her crystal glass filled with champagne from the podium shelf. She raised it high into the air, a triumphant, gleaming smile plastered across her face. To Vanessa, Diane projected over the crowd, and to the new era of the Mercer estate. The guests began to raise their glasses. I stepped out from the shadow of the hedges. I did not yell. I did not sprint. I simply walked at a steady, measured pace directly into the center of the manicured lawn, cutting through the sea of white tables until I was standing less than 10 feet from the podium. The clinking of glasses slowly died away. Whispers rippled through the front row of guests. Diane looked down at me, her triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second before hardening into a glare of sheer venom. "Eloise," Diane hissed, her voice low but caught by the microphone. "Sit down. You are ruining the toast." I looked past her to the notary, then back to the matriarch of the family. I took a deep breath, letting my voice carry across the dead, silent garden without the aid of a microphone. "I just have one quick question before we drink to the new era. Diane," I said, my words crisp and sharp enough to cut glass. "Under what exact legal authority did you just sign that transfer? Considering you were permanently removed as the resident steward of the Mercer Homestead Preservation Trust under County File Number 4829, and you currently hold zero status as an active trustee?" The entire garden froze. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. No one took a breath. No one moved a muscle. The only sound was the sudden, sharp clatter of the gold fountain pens slipping from the hands of the paralyzed notary and hitting the wooden podium. The paralyzing silence hanging over the garden was suddenly shattered by the harsh, metallic screech of the front estate gates swinging wide open. Every head turned. Marching down the stone pathway with the undeniable authority of an approaching storm was Maeve Corrigan. She did not come alone. Flanking her on the left was a uniformed county deputy clerk, and on her right was a stoic process server clutching a thick stack of brightly tabbed manila folders. Maeve did not bother with pleasantries. She bypassed the rows of seated guests and marched directly toward the makeshift stage. "Stop this ridiculous charade right now," Maeve commanded, her voice cutting through the humid air with absolute authority. She pointed a sharp finger directly at the paper resting on the podium. "The document you just executed is legally void. It is not worth the ink you used to sign it." Diane gripped the edges of the wooden stand, her knuckles turning bone white. "Security, remove these people. This is a private, invite-only family event." Maeve ignored her entirely, turning to face the bewildered crowd of socialites and politicians. "For the record, and for the dozens of camera phones currently recording this, my name is Maeve Corrigan. I am the legally recognized successor trustee of the Mercer Homestead Preservation Trust. Both this primary estate and the riverside property belong exclusively to that trust." Maeve turned her piercing gaze back to Diane. "Due to massive, documented breaches of fiduciary duty, gross financial mismanagement, and direct violations of the conditional residency agreement, Diane Mercer has been officially stripped of all administrative authority. You have zero legal standing to transfer, sell, or manage these assets." The deputy clerk stepped forward, holding up a certified, stamped document bearing the official seal of the county. "The transfer of trustee power was recorded and finalized at 8 o'clock yesterday morning. The notice of violation is officially on the public record." Behind the podium, the private notary went ashen. His eyes darted from the stamped county papers to the fraudulent deed he had just notarized. realizing he was standing at ground zero of a massive, publicized fraud. He practically threw his gold stamp into his leather briefcase, backed away from Diane as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease, and quickly slipped off the edge of the patio into the fleeing crowd. Then, movement caught my eye. Beside the podium, the heavy tartan blanket fell to the stone patio. Celeste Mercer, whom Diane had propped up as a silent, fading accessory, gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. With a supreme effort that made the remaining guests gasp, she pushed herself up until she was sitting perfectly straight. Nolan immediately stepped out from the shadows, walked onto the patio, and gently angled the microphone stand down toward his grandmother. Celeste did not look at the crowd. She looked directly at her daughter. When she spoke, her voice was slow, gravelly, but possessed a terrifying clarity that echoed across the lawn. "I never gave you permission to give my home to Vanessa," Celeste stated, each word landing like a physical blow. "You are a thief, and you are a liar." The garden erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps. Diane completely snapped. The polished veneer of the society matron vanished, replaced by wild, unhinged panic. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "She manipulated her. Eloise is committing elder abuse. She confused my mother and forced her to sign things she does not understand. This is extortion." Maeve did not even flinch. She pulled a digital tablet from her briefcase and held it high. "We have a sworn time-stamped video evaluation conducted 48 hours ago by a board-certified, independent geriatric specialist right inside that house." Celeste Mercer was declared entirely of sound mind. Furthermore, she executed a new, binding declaration of intent yesterday, surrounded by neutral medical witnesses, explicitly banning you from ever controlling her assets again, before Diane could formulate another lie. A new voice cut through the chaos. A tall man in a tailored charcoal suit pushed his way out of the front row of guests. He was the representative from the private lending firm, the exact man Diane had invited to witness the transfer so she could secure her illicit loan. His face was a mask of professional fury. "Mrs. Mercer," the lender barked, his voice laced with utter disgust. "You sat in my office and assured our firm you held a free and clear title. You just attempted to publicly sign away collateral that you promised to us for a massive cash-out refinance." He turned his back on her, speaking loud enough for his associates to hear. "I am freezing all negotiations immediately. Your file is going straight to our internal fraud investigation department." A sharp, terrifying shriek tore through the air. Vanessa, clutching the sides of her designer white gown, looked as though she had been struck by a physical blow. The delusion she had been living in shattered instantly. "Mom, what did you do?" Vanessa screamed, tears of absolute panic ruining her carefully applied makeup. "I took money. I took thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits from 3 different influencer agencies. I promised them exclusive commercial access starting next month. If we do not own the cottage, I have committed civil fraud. They are going to sue me into bankruptcy." The reality of the situation crashed over the guests like a tidal wave. The elite society members did not want to be anywhere near a live crime scene. Chairs scraped violently against the grass as people scrambled to their feet. Women gathered their expensive purses, men adjusted their ties, and the crowd began a rapid murmuring exodus toward the front gates. The grand coronation had devolved into a catastrophic, daylight implosion of the Mercer reputation, but Diane was not done. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous. She snatched the microphone off the stand, the speaker emitting a harsh, piercing feedback squeal that made the few remaining guests cover their ears. Her face was flushed dark red, her eyes wild with a desperate, manic defiance. "You think a few stamped papers change anything?" Diane screamed into the microphone, spitting the words with pure venom. "I am the one living here. I am the one in possession. I will lock every single door on the main house and the cottage. I will deadbolt the gates. I am not leaving, and I want to see which one of you cowards has the guts to physically cross my threshold." She slammed the microphone onto the podium, grabbed Vanessa by the arm, and dragged her terrified daughter toward the grand double doors of the estate. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, the loud, definitive click of the deadbolt echoing across the rapidly emptying patio. The social theater was officially over. The final, brutal legal siege had just begun. As soon as the last of the horrified guests fled down the long gravel driveway, the true chaos ignited. The sharp crack of the deadbolt echoing across the patio was not the end of the conflict. It was the start of a full property standoff. Inside the main house, Diane went into full lockdown mode. Through the large bay windows, I watched her physically snatch a mobile phone out of the hands of a terrified catering supervisor. She ordered the temporary cleanup crew to barricade the side entrances and explicitly commanded them to ignore any instructions from Nolan or myself. She was desperately clinging to the illusion of absolute authority, retreating into the master suite and locking the heavy double doors behind her to establish a fortified perimeter. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of white silk darting across the lower lawn. It was Vanessa. She had hiked up her expensive designer gown and was sprinting full speed toward the riverside cottage. She was carrying 2 massive canvas tote bags. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to salvage her shattered influencer aesthetic by pillaging the property. She was stripping the cottage of the vintage cameras, the expensive staging decor, and a collection of small, priceless Mercer antiques she had casually appropriated for her content backdrop. She was no longer just a delusional daughter. She was actively stealing trust assets. Every instinct in my body screamed to run down that hill and physically block her car. But I forced myself to stay completely still. I dialed Maeve instead. We were not going to give Diane the dramatic domestic disturbance she so desperately wanted. Maeve immediately dispatched a county deputy for a civil standby and authorized me to call an emergency locksmith. We began meticulously documenting the exterior condition of every single door and window, establishing an undeniable paper trail of the physical state of the estate, while the authorities monitored the perimeter, while waiting for the locksmith by my car. I logged into the secure digital portal, where I had uploaded the financial scans from the Blue Ledger. I was cross-referencing a bizarre utility shutoff notice when I stumbled onto a buried digital file. It was a secondary home equity application. My breath caught in my throat. The application was for a revolving credit line of $75,000, explicitly earmarked for roof repairs. At the bottom of the document was the signature of Celeste, but it was completely wrong. The angles were too sharp, the pressure too even. Diane had forged the signature of her own mother. Worse, I traced the routing numbers attached to the disbursement. The funds never went to a roofing contractor. They were funneled directly into a separate private checking account strictly used to pay off massive, high-interest credit card debts belonging solely to Diane. When I relayed this discovery to Maeve, her response practically vibrated with lethal satisfaction. She formally split our legal assault into 2 distinct tracks. The first was the civil dispute regarding the immediate eviction and trust management. The second was a direct referral to the district attorney for felony forgery and financial fraud. Diane was no longer just facing the loss of her social standing. She was staring down the barrel of a criminal indictment. This 2-front war would absolutely paralyze her. Near the front gates, Nolan managed to intercept Vanessa as she tried to speed away in her luxury sport utility vehicle. He stood directly in front of her bumper, forcing her to roll down the window. It was a heartbreaking exchange to witness. My husband, ever the protector, offered his little sister a single, golden lifeline. He told her to carry the stolen antiques back into the house and agree to give a sworn statement detailing exactly what fraudulent legal documents Diane had pressured her to sign. If she cooperated, he promised to shield her from the brutal trust litigation. Vanessa just gripped her steering wheel, her eyes wild with selfish panic. She screamed that he was ruining her brand. She completely ignored the devastating legal reality closing in around her. Terrified only of losing her sponsorships, she threw the car into reverse and sped off into the afternoon, choosing her online image over her own salvation. By nightfall, the temporary staff had abandoned the property. The grand estate felt like a quiet, massive tomb. Celeste insisted Nolan and I sleep in the ground floor guest room of the main house. We had managed to secure the lower level, but she strictly forbade us from relaxing, sitting in the dim light of her bedroom. Celeste warned us that a woman whose entire identity relied on public perception was infinitely more dangerous the exact moment that reputation was destroyed. Around 2 a.m, my phone lit up with an urgent email from Maeve. Diane had somehow managed to find a cut-rate attorney willing to work after hours. They had electronically filed a desperate, sloppy emergency injunction attempting to block the transition of the trustee powers, claiming Maeve and I had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a vulnerable senior citizen. Maeve countered the filing within 14 minutes. She uploaded the comprehensive violation logs, the time-stamped medical competency video, and the ultimate kill shot, a high-definition video clip from the brunch, clearly showing Diane confessing her fraudulent commercial plans directly into a microphone while entirely of sound mind. I lay awake staring at the ornate plaster ceiling as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window panes. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp this morning. The truth was fully exposed. The financial crimes were documented, and the legal snare was pulled tight. Yet, as I listened to the absolute silence of the house, a cold knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. We had won the war on paper, but my mother-in-law was still barricaded somewhere above me, and the physical possession of the 2 houses remained violently unresolved. The emergency hearing convened precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. The sterile, wood-paneled courtroom felt light years away from the manicured lawns and forced elegance of the Mercer estate. Maeve Corrigan did not just present our case. She performed a ruthless legal autopsy. She laid out the trust documents, the glaring fiduciary violations, and the undeniable evidence of the forged credit applications. The judge watched the time-stamped medical video of Celeste demonstrating absolute cognitive clarity, followed immediately by the chaotic footage of my mother-in-law publicly claiming ownership at the garden party. Diane sat at the defense table beside a visibly sweating discount attorney she had scrambled to hire in the middle of the night. When it was his turn to speak, he fumbled through his notes, desperately attempting to paint his client as an overwhelmed, devoted daughter who had simply made good-faith administrative errors while trying to care for her aging mother. It was the exact defense we had anticipated. I did not even look at Diane. I simply handed Maeve the heavy binders Nolan and I had built on the freezing garage floor. Maeve submitted the blue ledger into evidence. Alongside the mountain of our personal savings receipts, the digital footprint of the diverted loan funds hiding her credit card debt, and the executed contracts Vanessa had used to illegally lease the property. The narrative of the overwhelmed caregiver evaporated instantly under the crushing weight of the paper trail. The judge had seen enough. He slammed his gavel down, his voice echoing with absolute finality. He legally invalidated the fraudulent deed transfer. He ruled that Diane had grotesquely violated her conditional residency, permanently suspending any right she had to occupy the premises. He granted Maeve full, immediate administrative control and authorized the county deputies to execute a swift eviction to reclaim the properties. An hour later, the reality of the courtroom hit the gravel driveway of the estate. 2 county squad cars were parked out front, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. The supervising deputy stood by the wrought iron gates, officially demanding the heavy brass keys. Neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, watching the spectacle unfold. Diane was backed against the stone pillar, her designer clothes rumpled, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying denial. She lunged toward the gate, gripping the iron bars, and screamed at the top of her lungs to the watching street, swearing that both houses were supposed to go to Vanessa. She screamed it like a desperate spell, as if sheer volume could somehow rewrite property law. I walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. For years, I had kept my head down, silently swallowing her insults to keep the peace. But peace built on submission is just a hostage situation. I stopped 2 feet away from her. I looked directly into her frantic, furious eyes. Funny, because legally you're just a squatter. That single sentence broke the final illusion. It was the first time I had ever drawn a hard, immovable boundary against her toxicity, stepping out of the shadows to protect my family. As the deputies escorted her off the property, a familiar luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. Vanessa rolled down the window, taking one look at her mother standing on the public sidewalk with nothing but a designer handbag. The moment Vanessa realized the bank accounts were frozen and there was no secret cash reserve to bail out her ruined brand, she rolled the window right back up and sped away. Abandoning her mother entirely, it was a cold betrayal. But karma had already caught up to Vanessa. By the end of the week, she was drowning in civil litigation, sued by multiple influencer agencies for taking thousands of dollars in deposits for a property she never had the authority to advertise. Back inside the quiet sanctuary of the main house, Celeste drafted a formal, binding amendment to the Preservation Trust. She bypassed the toxic bloodline entirely. Nolan and I were legally appointed as the permanent resident stewards, granted long-term occupancy rights. She decreed that any future transfer of ownership would be strictly bound to conservation criteria, ensuring the estate would never again be held hostage by a golden child looking for a quick payout. 6 months later, the air turned crisp and cold. Nolan and I had painstakingly restored the riverside cottage, adhering strictly to the historical easement guidelines. We did not build an open concept or a flashy content studio. Instead, we transformed it into a quiet, subsidized residency for local historians and working artists. The main house was finally warm, secure, and fully repaired, giving Celeste the peaceful, dignified life she deserved. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, I sat on the back porch with Nolan and Celeste. We drank hot tea. Listening to the quiet rush of the river, I looked at the solid brick walls surrounding us. The greatest lesson of this entire nightmare was not about winning a real estate battle. It was the hard, undeniable realization that occupying a space for decades never equals ownership, and that sharing a bloodline can never replace the safety of absolute legal boundaries. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below with your location so we can chat and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by as many people as possible.